What's up everyone, Thomas here, aka Restroom's Trainer, and welcome back to another one of my videos. So it's been a while since my last video came out, and well, I've been busy. Yeah, alright. After the last two videos came out, I gave myself a break. And then I did what I do best, and procrastinated. And if it wasn't for Reshiram, I'd be playing Tears of the Kingdom right now. But I'm getting off topic. So, I'm sure a lot of us at some point have been surprised by the official heights of some Pokémon, discovering that they're either much larger or much smaller than what we originally thought. And a lot of them just don't feel right. So today, I'll be covering all the Pokémon whose size I would change. Well, kinda. For starters, there's currently 1,025 different Pokémon out there, which is a lot. So I figured I would instead do it by region, with this first video covering the original 151 Kanto Pokémon. Another thing to mention is that although it's referred to as height in the games, there are plenty of Pokémon where its height actually refers to its length, and length is a lot harder to determine when all I have is the official art. So I'm just gonna not include any of them. And since as far as I'm aware, there's no proper way to know for certain if a Pokémon's height is actually its length, it'll be entirely guesswork. To help give more of a visual reference, I'll be using Reshiram and myself for comparison. For context, Reshiram is 10'6", while I'm 5'11". And lastly, remember that this entire video is based on my opinion, which you are completely free to disagree with. Now let's continue on with the video. So to start off with, let's talk about Charizard. Now Charizard is definitely a Pokémon that gets brought up a lot in these kinds of conversations, since despite basically being a dragon in all but type, Charizard is only 5'7". Yeah, I would actively look down on him. Like, this thing is meant to be able to fly you around from place to place, yet it's not only shorter than I am, but weighs less as well. I feel like Charizard should be at least 7'7", or something around there, because its current height just feels wrong. Next up is my least favourite Pokémon in the series, Blastoise. Big turtle with cannons on its back, and it's even shorter at 5'3". Yeah, I should not be dwarfing this thing in height. I'm making him 6'6". The next Pokémon is one you might not expect, Raichu. Now obviously, Raichu isn't meant to be big like Charizard and Blastoise. It's an evolution of Pikachu, so of course it's meant to be small, but not 2'7" small. Whenever I imagine Raichu, I always imagine it being at least 3'6" or so. Not massive by any means, but not tiny. Next up is Nidoqueen and Nidoking, another Pokémon that's known for its surprising height. Now these two are almost kaiju in design, should be forgiven for thinking they were 7 foot or more. But nope, Nidoqueen is 4'3", and Nidoking is 4'7". Yep, these things don't even reach my shoulder. That definitely doesn't feel right. So I'm making Nidoqueen 6 foot, and Nidoking 6'3". The next Pokemon I want to cover is Ninetales. Now Ninetales is 3'7", which doesn't sound too unusual, though I do feel that she could definitely be a bit bigger, say around 4'7". Another thing worth mentioning is that in several games, Ninetales is a counterpart to Arcanine, who was a whopping 6'3", and almost made the list before deciding that it didn't seem all too unusual. But since they're counterparts, it would make some level of sense that they're similar in size, which is far from the case. So giving Ninetales an extra foot wouldn't close the size gap entirely, but it would certainly make it less awkward. Next is Golbat. Now, being the evolution of Zubat, you'd imagine it'd be around 3 foot or so at most. But instead, Golbat is 5'3". Yeah, that is one massive bat. Like, imagine going through a dark cave and seeing this thing. I've done work experience in caves before, including ones with bats in them. Seeing a 5'3" tall bat hanging from the ceiling would probably convince you that vampires were real. So I'm shrinking him down to 3'9" at least. Still big, but slightly less terrifying. Up next is Golduck, who is 5'7". Do you know what other Pokemon we mentioned so far is also 5'7"? Charizard. Yep, Charizard and Golduck are the same height. I don't think I need to tell you why that's weird. And even without the comparison to Charizard, that still seems quite big. So I'm shrinking him down to 4'6". The next Pokemon is Primeape. Now you'd expect this fuzzy ball of anger to be somewhat large, and at least close in height to the average human. 3'3" is definitely not within that ballpark. That seems way too small. So instead, I made him 4'7", which feels a lot more reasonable. Alakazam is our next Pokemon, and despite being quite human-like in design, he's only 4'11", which feels kinda short. So I made him 5'7" instead. I don't think I need to explain much else. Up next is Machoke and Machamp. Now you'd think these big, bulking, muscle-building Pokemon would be decently tall, at least 6 foot, but of course not. Machoke is 4'11", and Machamp is 5'3". How are they this short? They should be just as tall, if not taller than me. So I'm adding a foot to both of them, making Machoke 5'11", and Machamp 6'3". Next up is Rapidash, who is 5'7", which on its own doesn't sound too weird, but it's when you consider that Rapidash is basically a horse that trainers can easily ride around on, that Rapidash starts to seem a bit small. So I think raising her to 6'11" would make slightly more sense. The next Pokemon is Cloyster, who is 4'11", which is certainly bigger than I thought it was. I feel like making it 3'11" is a bit closer to what I'd normally imagine it to be. Next up is the entire Ghastly line, starting with Ghastly itself, which is 4'3". Yes, Ghastly, who most of us probably thought was like 1.5 feet tall, is actually 4'3", which is insane. So I'm bumping him down to 2 foot tall. And a similar case is being made for Haunter, who is 5'3", which definitely feels larger than it needs to be. So I'm making him 3'3". And lastly is Gengar, who is 4'11". Yep, you heard me right, Haunter is taller than Gengar. Though even without that comparison, 4'11" seems a bit short for Gengar. So I'm making him 5'11" instead. Up next is Hitmonchan, another human-like Pokemon that's surprisingly short at only 4'7". Now I'm not saying that Hitmonchan has to be tall. I mean, look at Little Mac. Though I do think that it could be a bit taller, around 5'3" or so. The next Pokemon is Chansey, who you'd probably think to either be 5 or maybe even 6 foot tall, but instead, she's 3'7", which is way smaller than I was expecting. I legit expected her to be around 5'7" or so at least. Electabuzz is the next Pokemon. Now Electabuzz is the Pokemon that I always thought was around 5 foot or so. But nope, 3'7", which feels a fair bit smaller than it should be. So I'm making it 4'7" instead. And finally, our last Pokemon is Kabutops, who is only 4'3". Now that size probably doesn't sound too unusual to a lot of you, and I almost considered not including it. But I can't help but feel that it could be a bit bigger, around 5 foot or so. And with that, we've gone through every Gen 1 Pokemon that I think could have their size changed. What do you think about this? What are some Pokemon from Gen 1 that you think could be larger or smaller? Let me know down in the comments. And if this video does well enough, I might consider doing a follow-up where I cover Johto Pokemon instead. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it would really help this channel out. Have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time. See ya!